When's a tax cut not actually a tax cut? When it's delivered by the SNP. Hello and welcome to Reality Check. Less spin, more stats. I'm Michael Simmons, the Spectator's economics editor, and today I want to drag you all to my homeland, Scotland. We're not going to talk about Nicola Sturgeon, we're not going to talk about camper vans. I want to talk about the SNP's budget for Scotland that was delivered last week. Now, they always try to make attention-grabbing headlines when they announce any policies in Scotland, and I used to work, actually, in the Scottish Government, and the sort of hidden mantra was always, we need to be doing better than England. We need to be comparing ourselves to the rest of Britain. And that was exactly true for the comm strategy of this budget too. The main headline that they want you all to take away from this is that after the delivery of this budget for 2026, the majority of Scots will be paying less income tax than were they to live in the rest of the UK. And by the way, let's be really clear about this. When they say the rest of the UK, they just mean England. They don't really care about Wales or Northern Ireland. But anyway, is their claim true? Well, in theory, yes. And that's because this complicated income tax system that they've got in Scotland, where you have 6 bands rather than the 3 that we have in the rest of Britain. They took the 2 lowest bands and they ended fiscal drag. So they lifted the freezing of the thresholds on those 2 bands and increased them by 7.4%. So because of that being higher than inflation, it means that, in theory, lower earners end up paying less tax. What that actually looks like in practice has been described by Dan Needle, the tax expert, as the smallest tax cut in world history. It works out, for low-income earners, about £40 a year better off than in the rest of the UK. So that's a cut of less than £1 a week. It's been pointed out that this tax cut is so small that it might actually end up costing, small businesses and self-employed people more money just to implement it than they'll actually see in any benefit. What's really worrying, though, is the bit that the SNP don't want you to pay attention to, and that's how much worse off you are if you're a higher earner in Scotland. The people on above the median earnings are going to be paying thousands of pounds more a year than if they lived in England or Wales or Northern Ireland. And that seems to me a bit of a bizarre way to run a country. If you think about the sort of the dream individual that the Scottish Government say they want to create, it's a well-educated university graduate that goes on into a profession. Well, if you look at the marginal tax rate for someone like that, someone that's got a student loan, someone that's gone into a job, maybe medicine, maybe law, maybe architecture, where they're earning, higher than average incomes, they could end up with a marginal tax rate of nearly 80%. At that point, you'd think, why bother? Come join us down in England. What's more, though, is they didn't just claim that this tax cut would make Scotland the lowest tax-paying part of the UK. They said that it was a benefit focused at the poorest earners. But the trouble is the tax system just doesn't work like that. Everyone gets the benefit up the higher end of the scale. Obviously, overall, there is no benefit because they're way worse off. But if you look at just the lifting of those thresholds at the lower end, the lowest earners only see a benefit of about £11, whereas someone on £100,000, yes, they'll be worse off than in England, but they get the full 34-ish pounds of that cut. So actually, if you look at where this benefit goes, even though it's not really a benefit, it goes to way more towards the wealthy. But more importantly than all of that, it's not actually a tax cut at all. It's a tax cut when you compare it to the rest of the UK for lower earners. But they may have stopped fiscal drag, but they haven't stopped something else called fiscal creep. And that's the freezing of the very lowest point, the freezing of the personal allowance. Now, because that's not increased with inflation, it's cost everybody £74 a year. And that's bigger than the tax cut they're offering anyway. If you're actually looking at these numbers, in real terms, no one's even getting a tax cut at all. Which makes me ask, how can the SNP get away with this? Now, anyone who's ever criticised the notion of an independent Scotland always has the same allegation thrown at you. It's that you think that your country is too wee, too poor, or too stupid to go its own way. Well, I'm starting to think that the SNP, if they think they can get away with this kind of statistical trickery, must think their own voters are too stupid. And Reality Check's seen some YouGov polling that the Scottish Government commissioned that sort of proves the point. Over a number of years, the government asked YouGov to ask voters in both Scotland and England, the rest of the UK, if they understood the income tax system, if they understood the tax they paid. And what it showed was that UK voters, the majority of them, did have a clear understanding of tax. But in Scotland, the opposite was true. There was quite a big gap, and the majority didn't. So maybe the SNP are playing up on this. Maybe they do think that they can get away with this. But even if they do, the claim that most Scots are paying less tax as a result of this budget may end up just fading away anyway. And that's actually happened before. When they first implemented this for the 2019 tax year, everyone wondered why Derek Mackay, who was then the Scottish Finance Minister, brought in these new tax bands that basically made no difference to what households were paying and made a negligible difference to the overall budget. And the reason he did that was clear. It was, again, so that they could make this claim that most Scots would be paying less tax than if they lived in the rest of the UK. And by the way, side note, it's worth a Google Derek Mackay to see what happened to him. But what happened to his claim? Well, it was based on forecasts that were provided to the Scottish Government about what was going to happen to median, so average earnings. And what ended up happening was those average earnings increased more than the government had been told to expect. Now, that's a good thing for workers, but it was a very bad thing for the SNP because it meant that more people ended up paying more tax, and the opposite of the claim ended up being true. And Scotland ended up being the highest tax part of the UK. And I feel the SNP have left themselves to that trap again. It wouldn't take wages rising all that much faster than they're expected to do now for median incomes to go up and the exact same thing to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if within a couple of years' time, most Scots, it actually turns out, are paying more tax than if they lived in England. So I think the lesson here is when it comes to tax and spend, the SNP, I'm afraid, just can't be trusted. Thanks for listening to Reality Check. Hope you enjoyed the show. I had fun making it. If you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss an episode. If you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, then please give us a follow so you get notified too. And don't forget, we do a newsletter every Friday with a roundup of the week and a recap of the show. And for more details on all of that, go to spectator.com/realitycheck.